Okay, folks, we'll see how this goes. We do have the full panel of speakers for today, and I must say that that's been a cracking program of speakers. I actually think that this would have stood up in any Botanic Garden conference anywhere in the world as a day event. So maybe in the first instance, what about thanking all the speakers for the day? Open mic Q&A is the idea now. So any questions of any speakers would be welcomed.
I'm Virginia from Plant Trust, and I just wanted, a lot of you would have been at the last BGANZ where we spoke, but what Plant Trust does is register collections of plants that people, and a lot of the botanic gardens are involved, and also a lot of private. So I'm just responding to your point about plant heritage in Britain. We are connected with plant heritage, it's the same background. There it is in various countries, Germany, America, the places where people are obsessed by plants.
A show of hands for gardens that are actually holding national collections. So there is some low-hanging fruit here.
Geelong did, but no longer does.
Right, there's some low-hanging fruit. Thanks, Virginia. Any other questions of this talented panel? Sturt.
I wanted to ask about the role Botanic Gardens play helping local councils in conserving. For an example, in the Mornington Peninsula there's a lot of dieback and street eucalypts. I wanted to find out what role Botanic Gardens can play in helping local councils save some of these plants, their own native plants. We're talking about helping each other in botanic gardens, but there's a wider community out there that needs help in saving their street landscapes and what's happening to the dieback and everything like that.
It's a really good question, Sturt, and that speaks to having influence beyond our boundaries. Does anyone on the panel have any thoughts on that, Greg?
I can only really speak for what occurs in my area, but we do work closely with our two closest LGAs on weed eradication, species selection, and provide some advice on some of their plant issues. Obviously our resources are fairly limited, but we do check in fairly regularly on the threatened species in our areas, and particularly weeds is of greatest interest for them around us. But the advice is certainly there, so I'd encourage any of the LGAs to make contact and form those relationships with their local botanic garden, because if you don't knock on the door, you won't get any help.
Thanks, Greg. Claire's got a few insights, because at one stage Claire had a...
Yeah, I was just going to say that I've having worked in local government as well, that and particularly botanic gardens or large gardens in local government, I always found that there was a really good connection to the Botanic Garden Network to rely on, seek advice from, collaborate with, receive plants from, and that extended out into the general community as well. And one of the earliest roles that I did have was with the City of Casey as Botanic Development Officer, and that was to literally work with the Cranbourne Botanic Gardens and bring those ideas, including plant lists, current thinking, pest and disease, things like that, back out into the community, working with the gardens that were in the City of Casey, in particular it was Wilson Botanic Park, and extending that, the ideas, the education, the information, well beyond the garden gates of Botanic Gardens. So I'd say that is there. Is it established as a more formal network? Well, things like BGANZ are, because we know that some of our Botanic Gardens are under the are with local governments. So I think it's a two-way thing. So it's about, and I'll go back to Terry's comment, which was making sure that we've got that horticultural resilience in local government as well, where that knowledge can be supported and putting more resources into that area. Again, it's when you are often in a local government environment, you are sometimes the only expert. So very different to a place like Melbourne, where, you know, for me, coming here and only being here for a year, I'm more of a conduit because I'm surrounded by experts. So it's about reaching back into the Botanic Garden network and I guess extending things like BGANZ to make sure that we are collaborating the best way that we can. But it's a growing area and something that we can all improve in.
Any other
It's a short answer.
Roger Elliott.
Just a comment on, it's a question I suppose. When Dave was talking about the survey that you did with 6 to 10-year-olds or whatever, and then the parents found the kids got bored, has any thought been given to try and educate those parents? Because I don't think it's the kids' problem. I think it's the parents' problem. That they don't know where to lead them.
I guess I should answer that. So, the parents were saying some really interesting stuff. They recognised that their kids were spending most of the times with their parents rather than with other kids. I think there's some really interesting societal issues at play here. I think, I don't think there's anything wrong at all with the kids. But it's this kind of combination, I think, of time, lack of time. Parents seem to need to have very organised lives, like everything was very directed. Like I don't think we can answer that here, but I think that yes, we should definitely not be blaming the kids, but trying to work out ways of allowing kids to be kids and to spend time with other kids, and you know, nature's a great place to do that. So I don't know if anyone has any other comments on. Yeah.
If you drop kids in any environment, they'll have a great time and find a way to play. I drop my kids in snake-infested swamps and all sorts of habitats frequently, and they absolutely love it. You see kids in the Botanic Garden all the time. If they're taken to that space, they'll really enjoy nature and learn from it. But you've got to drop them in there, and as you're suggesting, parents just aren't doing that.
I want to add one thing. So one other really interesting thing that came out was the youth group said that when they were kids, they kept getting dragged around to bloody national parks, camping, and going to gardens, and they hated it. But then by the time that they could make those decisions more independently, a lot of them actually then really started to enjoy those experiences with. So I think that these are really interesting, learnings. So there's good stories in that, but we've still got a little way to go as society, I think.
Sure. At the back.
I could suggest that you start lobbying strongly to have banned the ads on TV for Pinoclean, hand cleaner, hand steriliser. It horrifies me. And the other day I was somewhere and a woman was with her 2 children, and they come out of a public building, and the mother was putting the hand cleanser on her, and she said, "Oh, you've actually touched some doorknobs. You better clean your hands." And I honestly believe that those kinds of ads, and people are proud to call themselves now a germaphobe when it comes to their children. They think it's a badge of honour, and I think it's had a huge detrimental effect. And just yesterday, my young grandson thought he saw a pebble on our car. He picked it up to throw it away, and it was some possum poo, and he thought he was going to die. And we had to tell him that no, there's a whole science of studying poo, and it tells us about our ancestors and so on.
Scatology.
Really, it is a serious problem that's happening now, and it's across the board, and I think that gardens people ought to start lobbying that those ads are just not on TV.
Does anyone have a view on nature play on the panel?
So I'm working with some researchers at the University of Tasmania who look at the microbiome, so in different ways, some soil, some airborne and some in marine systems. But they've kind of identified a fourth pathway. We talk about nature being good for encouraging physical activity, for mental health and social interactions that all have really positive health benefits, health promotion benefits. But this fourth pathway of actually getting dirty and getting your immune system functioning again is likely to be more important than all of those put together, I think, the way research is going. So there's really strong evidence starting to grow to suggest that we should make our kids filthy and, you know, share germs and that kind of stuff. So, sounds good.
Tim Rowe, and then we'll come over here.
I just want to make a comment. Working in local government for far too long now. There is a movement within early years learning, kindergartens, from push kinder, and there's a lot of activity now in that space around reconnecting young children with the bush. And you know, in our little municipality, down east there in Sale and elsewhere, we are deliberately building structures to allow kids to connect with nature. So, you know, that goes some way to your comment around, you know, assisting people reconnect with young people, reconnect with nature, and that's building.
And facilitating that, supporting it and facilitating it.
And, you know, my park staff said, well, we just put all these plants in, we don't want them broken down. And I said, well, actually we do, because we want to connect these guys with it.
Yep.
And, you know, we're working with those kinders to reconnect, and it's taken a little bit of learning for our parks guys to accept that, providing sticks that they can build, you know, cubbies with and all that sort of stuff. But that's you know, that's happening, and that's a really positive move.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for that, Tim. Just here.
Yeah, this is probably a comment, and
Please.
please don't take it as a criticism. I'm here on the first time I hang out in Botanic Gardens. I blame my grandmother, but I came along because I'm actually a mycologist by trade, an ecologist by interest. And if you are building databases and ways to gather information, I've been speaking with a lot of Society for Growing Australian Plants since I moved to Melbourne 4 or 5 years ago, and those groups lean forward when I put my slides up and I tell people which are the mycorrhizal plants, which are the non-mycorrhizal plants, and what endophytes are. So if you're going to build databases, I think that would be, we don't have all of that information, but that information does exist. So if you're going to start building a capacity, people are interested, and if you can just start somewhere, that would be great.
And it's important.
Just reflect on, there's an orchid conservation project which is happening out of the Crown
Well,
Gardens.
orchids people are awesome, they have to conserve.
Exactly,
It's
yeah,
better growth
yeah,
otherwise,
exactly.
but
And that's not about growing orchids, it's about growing the fungus
yeah,
that the
so
orchids all host on.
it's the orchid people seem to be the only one who are seed saving, and I loved the taking samples from the mountaintops, because you'll be catching their endophytes in those samples,
In those samples.
and they have a drought tolerance, so
Yep.
hang on to them.
Warren,
I'll just add to that,
please.
we are actually using the experience and the knowledge of the scientists on these field collections and mountaintops, and they are actually giving us the information where there are strong associations. I mean, there's some of the Lycopodiaceae, which are absolute, they're just like the orchids for germination. They must have the association present to grow. So there is that collective knowledge there, and it is being stored for exactly the purposes you're endorsing.
I've got a question for Lydia. The ANPC has come up a couple of times, and the first Australian Network for Plant Conservation. The first iteration of ANPC was Mark Richardson and company out of the National Botanic Gardens, and it was very much a botanic garden focus. And ANPC sort of turned their back a little bit on ex situ conservation as a valid conservation tool, and it was more about managing threatening processes in the wild. It seems like there's been a big swing back to ex situ conservation as a legitimate conservation tool. Have you got any comments on that?
I'm not sure I can claim to know too much about ANPC and its sort of strategic directions in a way, but as an observation, I think, yes, it has definitely come back around, and they have an annual conference where last year the theme was all about translocations and ex situ work that supports that. So I guess there is a change maybe in the kind of work that they're advocating. And another observation, I guess, in my understanding of the different organisations is that ANPC, I believe, are also partly try to move beyond just the Botanic Gardens network and bring in other land management agencies, and so I guess that's one way of connecting a broader network.
That multidisciplinary thing.
Mm.
Yeah, sure. Other questions from the floor?
John, Leonie Scribble from Adelaide Botanic Garden. Lots of fun fact for the panel. I'm particularly excited about the collecting of the tropical mountain flora. So my PhD in Adelaide was looking at the Maslin Bay fossil flora. So this is an Eocene aged macroflora, and it's incredibly diverse as a flora. And ironically, these mountain refuge locations that are now being collected from are Australia's nearest living relatives of those floras that we had in the southeast back in the Eocene time. So to actually see some of those collections go into Botanic Gardens is, for me, like closing the loop on a big circle, and the interpretation and the story, the potential, knowledge that we gain from how that flora adapts to these different locations is going to go into. It's really important. So it's really exciting.
Sure. Yeah, it absolutely is. And any?
I'll just add what a cool story to tell. That's fantastic.
Looking at the climate resilience of some of these plants, and we've got a modern day analogue, but we've got a fossil record as well, and we know a fair bit about that now as well, and being able to pull those two stories together and get a little bit of an understanding of what potentially was here and what we've actually lost, but what we've kept, and perhaps why we've kept it. It might not just be as simple as what we've been, putting it down to. So there's some really interesting research to come from that.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Be calm, folks. The Botanic Garden Collection and Records Management is an emerging group. We've got the Be Calm Brains Trust here. Is there anything to report on Be Calm? Because I skimmed over it. But
well, John's had here for a minute, like, Hey, John. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Our vision ties in really much with what's happened today. It's about sharing knowledge, about getting those collections, getting people aware of what other gardens have, what other gardens are doing. So in other words, there's a collection right across just Australia, but even in New Zealand, where they're going, why we're growing the plants, why we're putting the energy in. And hopefully, if Big Arm grows, which I hope it does, and excuse the pun, but I hope it does grow into a really great communication between all botanic gardens and underline and underpin and support plant conservation in what we've been talking about today. John, do you want to ask a follow-up to that?
no, I'm just getting a BGANZ Council perspective from Chris.
Yeah, certainly. Previously, under the BGANZ banner, we've had a number of different working groups that we've heard. So Botanic Gardens Engagement Network is still active. BRON was the previous incarnation Botanic Gardens Records Officer Network, which, as I think John did mention earlier, achieved a few things but kind of ran out of puff. And it's really exciting that John and Ben Light and also Peter Symes have, I guess, reinvigorating but broadening the scope of that work to look at records management, but also more broadly collections development, which is really the heart of it. So BGANZ Council, which I'm the Victorian representative on, and Eamon is with us this afternoon as Executive Officer, accepted the proposal from John and Co to endorse the establishment of BCALM as a subgroup, a working group of BGANZ. So really great that there's that enthusiasm and initiative, and I think a lot of the stuff that we've talked about today clearly resonates with within the scope of that group.
I will say something about it.
You got the microphone?
I'll just speak loudly. I think the other thing that John and I have then had a number of discussions, and one of the things that came across to us was about making the regional gardens actually botanic gardens, but our feeling was we actually need to put collections back into botanic gardens, because I think a lot of gardens, and even our own, have sometimes lost sight or lost our way in terms of living collections. And we've heard today about being creative about telling engaging stories about plants, and we've actually failed, I think, as botanic gardens largely in getting that message across, and I think that was confirmed today. But if we can't tell the story about our collections and about our plants to the community, who can? It is our job. And so we sort of see this BGANZ as a mechanism, this group, as a mechanism to try and help that. If someone's got a great interpretation story, they can share it with others. Someone's got a great strategy plan, they can be sharing it with others. So to really try and pull that expertise and make collections almost front and centre in gardens again. So that's sort of where we've come from with it. Whether you agree with it or not, that's what we think.
Terry, please.
Can I just ask a question for Care for the Rare people?
Of course.
With the 6 botanic gardens that are going to get Care for the plants, can everyone hear me?
Use the mic, Terry.
With the 6 botanic gardens that are going to get Care for the Rare plants and that amazing story, how are you going to do the interpretive signs? How are you going to do that sort of collectively, or is that each botanic garden, or?
So the plan is to hold an interpretation workshop where we bring some interpretation experts to the fore. And the plan is for each of the 6 participating gardens at the end of the day to have a really succinct and well-considered interpretation plan that comes out of that planning day. For their own collections. And their own interpretive style. Absolutely, using their voice, telling their stories, but facilitated through some really clever interpretation planners. And then there's some money in the Care for the Rare budget to actually supply some signage or whatever the technique is. It might be don't know, but there's some capacity to be able to support and implement at least the first bit of that interpretation plan. So, and I think that's the point of the Care for the Rare. Certainly there's some conservation outcomes, having rare plants being grown in regional centres, but it's the capacity for those gardens to actually engage with the communities on telling those local plant conservation stories, which is really the potent. It's the driver that sits behind Care for the Rare, is the messaging and the engagement and the interpretation opportunities. So we're going to throw some resources at it. Yeah.
John, was there anything you thought of trying to get some of the native plant wholesale nurseries involved in Care for the Rare?
They're helping us grow the plants. So we're propagating them at Cranbourne, and then the propagules we're going to send to a wholesale nursery to bulk them up for us. But that's on a fee-for-service basis. I really like the Spherosphere. I really struggle with that. The commercialisation of that plant, and that worked.
Yeah, absolute success. We've continued to propagate. I think we've probably sold now somewhere in the order of about 1,200 plants.
Right.
So yeah, this is a thing that doesn't flower. It doesn't produce those beautiful blooms that people often like from their local hardware store. But it's got the story. That story along with it. It's an ancient plant. It's cool. It's local.
Yep. Beauty.
Geranium #1 is really beautiful. Why didn't that go commercial? Surely that would be good to have something that was thought to be extinct and is now in the Botanic Gardens.
Gonna throw to Meg. Can I throw to Meg? You've got it. So if I could, Meg's running a project called Raising Rarity, working with the Friends.
So we're basically targeting, we've got some volunteers in the audience as well.
Nice.
We're basically looking at species that predominantly are Victorian focus at the moment, that have to be rare and threatened, have to have either be federally threatened, critically endangered, tick most of those boxes, and we're growing them down at Cranbourne in the raised plots under the guidance of Warren and Roger Elliott, and we're just looking at their horticultural potential and finding some really interesting plants and how they're behaving 70 metres above sea level, when some of them are growing at 1,800 metres up on the Bovine High Plains. And we're just seeing some really fascinating stuff. And that's where now looking at the next generation and growing those on. That's why I was interested in what you were saying, that just that story that goes alongside when you're trying to market something. But
And the potential, Meg, is that some of those that do have ornamental attributes could be sold at the Friends Nursery potentially?
Definitely. We've got a beautiful stone medium. Some gorgeous Brackstone. And And they're just performing really, really well and unexpected for where they're from. We've got one, Braxton Tagellii, for example, from one population up on the Bogong High Plains that lives in a peat bog. It's growing beautifully down in Cranbourne in these open plots. It's flowering sometimes up to 3 times a season. And if that's not horticultural potential, I don't know. But it's just, we've got some really nice stories, and we're going to sell some of those at the next Cranbourne Friends and see how they go.
Great, thank you, Meg. I said we'd finish on time. Let's finish on time. Really fantastic day. A warm round of applause for all of our contributors. These days, of course, don't happen on their own, so I'd very much like us, well, I'm sure we all want to thank the entire BGANZ VIC committee. It was led by John Arnott as the key organiser, but everyone's contributed, as well as the Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria for hosting. Thank you, everyone. Thanks to our caterer, who's, I'm sure, flown the coop quite a while ago. And a thanks, of course, to our sponsors, as we've mentioned a few times, but Seasol, Augusta Golf Carts, and particularly for this event, the Helen McPherson Smith Trust. A reminder that the BGANZ Congress in Wellington, the early bird price closes on Friday. If you had any chance of getting over there, you'll save $100 or so by registering this week. A reminder that today's proceedings will be posted online on the BGANZ website. Not exactly sure how long that process takes, but keep an eye out. Eamon might send out a message about when that is available. And really, thank you to you all for contributing.